I personally find it hard to rewatch old videos of mine. When you get older and your view of the world becomes more nuanced, you sometimes look back at yourself and wonder why you sounded really shallow. It's fascinating but also cringe-inducing, and that is why I am normally hesitant to rewatch old stuff, and frequently private content I believe hasn't aged well. Currently, the oldest video you can access on my channel is my worst of 2014 list, and the difference in quality between then and now is like night and day. But while re-watching that video, my entry on The Evil Within stood out to me more than the others. It was a game I didn't expect to get a sequel for, and my reasoning behind the entry was shallow. I said that it was a good-looking game that was hampered by its knockoff Resident Evil 4 style gameplay, in addition to running horribly despite having to render about a quarter less of the resolution, thanks to the inclusion of letterboxing. That was literally the extent of my arguments, just generalized statements that don't hold up now. After all, Resident Evil 4's gameplay was the basis of third-person shooters going into the 7th generation of consoles. The visuals are, indeed, good, and the letterboxing argument no longer holds merit, due to a patch that gave you the option to turn it off. Plus, with the advancement of hardware on PC and a cheaper price point, means that any rendering issues are reduced, or its glaringness doesn't have as big an impact. I bought The Evil Within at full price at launch thanks to my love of the horror genre and appreciation of the works of Shinji Mikami, and in the end I came away feeling bitter and angry. My tastes have evolved and expanded since then, and I've been kinder to games since 2014 for the most part, so why not revisit The Evil Within? See if time has been kind to it. So I installed it on PC and started playing. A quick question. Is The Evil Within still bad after 4.5 years? The short answer is yes, but not in the same way I thought so back in 2014. I no longer think of it as the 8th worst game of the year because there's a lot of interesting things here, but the inconsistencies in both gameplay and especially story make it one of the most baffling games I have ever played. Replaying it on PC was a considerable improvement on my initial experience, with pop-in occurring at rare moments, and even without letterboxing, the game ran well at 60 frames per second. Although there were 2 instances where it tanks. This game still looks great, despite it running on a notoriously temperamental engine. id Tech 5 may be good looking, but its rendering engine gave way to noticeable pop-in, with the original Rage having its textures load only what the camera is facing, and even then, not very well. But with the power of nearly 5 years of hardware improvements, you only encounter this issue a handful of times. One thing I needed to get used to was the game's rocky loading technology. It may surprise you, but the loading screens are the most unstable of the industry. The operating system loading mouse appears constantly, giving you the impression that the game has, or is about to, become unresponsive. Still, throughout my 13 to 14 hours in the base game, the game crashed on me only once. So the majority of points I brought up in my original brief description are either minimized or fixed, yet I still consider this game to be fairly terrible. And why is that? The answer is simple: gameplay and narrative structure. The biggest problem with the game is that the tonal presentation of the mechanics and story isn't consistent. It establishes a tone that clashes with what came before and what comes after. In other words, this is how the game starts. This is what happens in the middle. And this is what happens at the end. The game is 13 to 14 hours long, but the transition between these different areas and situations aren't always smooth. Take a look at the first level. Traditionally, the first level is used to set up the tone of the story and mechanics, and thus we are much more forgiving for the more outlandish features of this world. It's clear from the introduction of the main villain, named Ruvik, that something isn't quite right with this mental institution. It could be corrupted by an entity who has turned it into their personal, twisted playground, or there could be a curse that demands retribution upon the trespassers. It's partially the core of Outlast 2, setting. The first level of The Evil Within emphasizes the underpowering nature of Sebastian, and makes it clear that hiding and distracting noisemakers are the ways to traverse this world. But then you immediately leave the hospital, the world around you is literally torn apart, one member of your crew turns into an infected being, before your vehicle crashes and you wake up to see yourself being pushed on a gurney in what is presumably a hospital ward. You get felt up by this monstrosity, then wake up in a derelict room. Moments later, you wake up in a burning wreckage in the middle of a dark forest. Over the next mission, you are introduced to syringes, a handgun, methods of lighting downed enemies on fire, stealth kills in which you use a knife, melee combat in which you don't use a knife, a variety of booby traps, a stamina system in which we realise that a fully trained police detective has less sprinting ability than my 4-year-old cousin, and arguably the most baffling upgrade system I have ever encountered. A good amount of these features would be fine if they were carefully placed over the span of several missions. But to go from the stealthy, atmospherically tense tone of the first level to this mechanically clashing design of the second level doesn't bode well for the player experience. Normally, you introduce the core of the game in the first level and largely maintain it throughout. I know this comparison is frowned upon, but Dark Souls' first level is a prime example of how to do the first level right. During my time with The Evil Within, I wasn't hiding in cupboards from the forces of a twisted mind, as the first level implied. I was gunning down hordes of enemies while smashing up the environment to look for the precious currency, in which I could upgrade my combat potential. There was only one, maybe two moments where I felt being stealthy was the optimal way to play, and those sections were times when I felt the game slowed to a crawl. I learned that the game was more of an action horror type when I was locked into a rotting meat deposit with several different monsters of varying sizes, and took them on with explosive crossbow bolts that you craft yourself. Even the bosses lose their luster after some time, when they are reused over and over again. Laura is a constant presence, they recycle the enemy in the opening chapter several times, and one time involves them wielding a rocket launcher. There are two boss fights which feel like a direct ripoff from the Soulsborne series. One looks like a cheap CGI humanoid that looks out of place. The final boss has the same jarring effects that the final boss in Dead Space had, and the Keeper is essentially a ripoff Pyramid Head you brush with several times, all the way down to fighting two of them in the final encounter. Speaking of that Laura, her first encounter is a prime example of poor signposting. I assumed that the uniqueness of the monster, and the fact that it had an instant kill attack, meant that I had to fight it. Seems reasonable, but in reality you're supposed to run, and this is not indicated until you go back through the doorway in which you entered. If you stayed in the room, you get no signal. And then there's this small room which made me think that, despite having just run away from Laura, that I had to fight it. The reason why was because the only door had a typical no entry symbol seen in the hospital safe room. I tried going through that door and it was locked, leading me to believe that all doors bearing the symbol would also be locked. Turns out that the universal signal of negative and no doesn't matter because you were optimally supposed to go through that door and continue the trend of running away from Laura. Did any of the Evil Within's playtesters encounter the same predicament, or was I seriously the only one who got the connotation that the door with the big red circle with a line dashed through meant that the door was unusable? I know I'm literally talking about a door texture, but there's so little consistency in anything. That same hospital door is unlocked and locked at random intervals with no rhyme or reason. Elements in gameplay and story are introduced and are suddenly dropped, like the booby-trapped chests, and it's impossible to figure out what the main villain wants to do with Sebastian Castellanos. It would be easy for us to assume that Ruvik wants to kill Sebastian, but his behaviour is inconsistent with the gameplay. Sure, Ruvik won't hesitate to slash your throat or literally turn you into a pile of gore when you control Sebastian, but in cutscenes and scripted sequences, he taunts you or teleports you elsewhere for no reason. Considering Sebastian is a complete hindrance to Ruvik's plan, and that he needs Leslie more than anyone to succeed in his plan, there's no reason why he would keep Sebastian alive. He took down 3 police officers in seconds, yet hesitates when in a corridor of his own making, containing a detective, an unarmed doctor, and a mentally handicapped patient. He is a literal idiot, yet possesses near limitless power and the genius knowledge to make connected consciousness technology happen. So yeah, the big spoiler is that this world isn't real, and it operates in almost the exact same way that the Matrix does. There's a thing in the back of your neck that plugs your consciousness into a shared world. That's a bunch of twisted memories of Ruvik. But it's hard to get a grasp on how this world actually operates. In the first Matrix film, the core rules are clearly established and understood. And one of the reasons why the sequels weren't received well is because it discounted what was already established. The Evil Within does not stick to key rules that the game itself establishes. Take the safe room, for example. After being introduced to it, you're shown early on that you can access it through little cracks of Ruvik's construct, represented by mirrors and the tones of Clair de Lune. Sometimes you need to collect a small text log written by Sebastian to open up, but that rule becomes firmly established. To exit, you look at a mirror or a single crack in Ruvik's construct again. The problem is that it doesn't follow that rule consistently, and you randomly enter or exit this area when the story demands it. Because the game is sometimes unable to smoothly transition from one setting to the next, it instead uses the safe room as a crutch. You get chased by a big monster and suddenly find yourself in the reception, which Ruvik is able to enter. He looks at you, shows you a memory, then you wake up in the safe room. After some time, you walk down a corridor and you glitch onto a road that leads you to a mansion. You don't get the sense that anything is really connected to each other, which might be a given considering we are trapped within someone's head, but explain this to me. Throughout the game, you collect these little memories that recall Sebastian's life, from the introduction of the woman who would later become his wife, to his life after the death of his daughter, and his wife's disappearance. That story is fine, even if it does fall into the typical tragic detective archetype, with bonus points for alcoholism. Maybe that's why his stamina's so low. His liver might be about to explode. Big problem. That whole story is utterly meaningless in the context of what we are playing. We're getting no big revelations about Sebastian, nothing that would change his character dynamic, and nothing contributes to the game. If you took it out, literally nothing would change. You wouldn't have to change a single line of dialogue or change the level design. It's that disconnected from the entire game. Sebastian doesn't even comment or react to these memos. You'd think he'd have something to say considering he's picking up very personal notes about his life in locations he has never visited. Even the reason why we are in Ruvik's dream doesn't get explained. By the end of the game, you defeat Ruvik, but you end up getting eaten in the process. As a result, you wake up and unplug yourself from the machine before destroying Ruvik's brain. Doing this will make you wake up in the exact same machine, but in the real world. Yep, it's a dream machine in a dream machine, but only one layer is explored, since, at the beginning of the game, you can see Ruvik essentially plug you in, but there is no explanation for how he got into the first dream layer to begin with, and it also brings up the question as to how Sebastian got out of the second dream layer. If it's because you defeated Ruvik, then fine, but you get the impression that Sebastian died to deliver the final fatal bullet to them. Does that mean that any death will allow you to wake up in the Dream Machine bathtub? Sebastian essentially sees a memory of Ruvik that has him plugged into the machine, so does he wake up in that location, or is he truly out of the second layer?
If I make it out alive, I'm never riding in an elevator again.
Notice how, by the end of the game, it drops all pretense of trying to be scary, and instead tried to create a game that's a patchwork of inspirations. It's like this game started out as a Resident Evil 4 spiritual successor, but ended up throwing in so many different sources of inspiration that it ends up becoming incoherent. Bit of Outlast here, some Matrix there, little bit of Inception sprinkled in, maybe some Silent Hill somewhere, and a tiny bit of Dead Space to finish off. It's so much of a mishmash that when I arrived at this demolished complex, the first thing I thought was Majula's theme from Dark Souls 2. It's almost like this game was designed to deliberately irritate me, and a prime example is the upgrade system. Maximum ammo you can carry being upgraded? Fine, I can deal with that, but why is there an upgrade that increases the clip capacity, even if it has nothing to do with the character's physical attributes? Why can we only carry a maximum of 5 matches to start with? They're matches! You can carry 20 of them in your pockets without it largely impacting your pocket space. Why is your stamina so pathetic to start with? And why are you forced into this cooldown animation that both takes too long and leaves you completely stationary? That specific meter and its effects puzzle me, because you cannot look at this and think that it's a good design feature, especially when the game wants you to run away from boss fights and swarms of enemies. Even when you upgrade your weapons and find yourself to have the capabilities of a basic human being, the game continues to add things that create more frustrations. After some time, the game gets the idea that giving the mindless enemies machine guns and bulletproof masks would make for a decent challenge, but it ends up being another test of patience, especially since, by the end of the game, I was getting some great headshots. Not even the healing is safe from baffling design decisions. If you want to use a syringe, you're forced to stand up and remain perfectly still as you administer it. The problem being that it opens you up for attacks, or, in one notable case, being beheaded by a blade-spinning carousel. The health pack that completely heals you up also gives off a nasty effect, one that near emulates the drunk controls and visuals from Grand Theft Auto, thus leaving you vulnerable to attacks, since you cannot fight during this time. I could go on about a lot of things, like no one is asking Sebastian what he is doing with the mirrors despite standing next to him when he teleports, or the destroyed city levels that include a turret section and the water monsters from Amnesia: The Dark Descent. They eat dead bodies that distracts them from you swimming. How can you interpret that differently? Or what about the final boss fights that completely throws away any gameplay lessons you have learned in favour of a turret section and a rocket launcher that doesn't even allow you the chance to figure out the boss's weakness and instead is happy to signal what you should be firing at with an inconspicuous red target? But here's the strange thing. I kept a notebook by my side and took notes as I descended deeper and deeper into the mind of Ruvik, and the one thing that mostly escaped my ire was the combat itself. I have complained about the upgrade system, the stamina system, the level design, and a slew of other things, but the gameplay, when it has a chance not to be mired in bad ideas, is satisfying and engrossing. After upgrading my pistol and shotgun a little, I found the act of killing these enemies, when they do not have the bulletproof masks, to be gratifying. The game really is at its weakness when it's trying to be stealth-focused, because of the moments where you could swear you are hidden before suddenly being spotted through the flukest of sights. But when it becomes more action-oriented, either through design or my stubbornness, I found myself really liking what was handed to me. The weapons sound fantastic, firing them is pleasing, and the sheer attention to detail has to be commended. It's a combat system that deserves a better game, because it is the missing link between Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space. Your weapons are powerful without being overpowered, and even with a 50% critical hit chance on a headshot, there are enemies that are exceptions to that rule, so you don't get comfortable. If you ever get this game, either on sale or through sheer madness, I recommend Survival difficulty. It's the hardest you can select at the start, and I found that, with the exception of several instances where level and boss design was at fault, the combat felt just right, and something I am anticipating when I take another crack at its sequel. Just look at this and tell me that this doesn't look and feel awesome. As much as I've derived the Keeper, aka Safehead, for being an obvious Pyramid Head knockoff, all the way down to the final encounter being you versus 2 of them, I did like the way he can teleport from one point to the other. It's fairly nerve-wracking when he arrives, and the fact that killing himself gives him the opportunity to circumvent obstacles you create is a cool twist. Although I don't know why he can't pull off that face-hugging attack on any of the numerous other safes you find lying around. The atmosphere and sound design in each level is all around great, to the point that even if I was getting frustrated with the story or level design, I was still feeling a sense of uneasiness thanks to that combination. And the soundtrack, which, while generic at points, does its job well. Although the end credits song is arguably the worst end credits song in the history of gaming. Yes, it's worse than Silent Hill 3. I do firmly believe that, while The Evil Within is still one of the worst games of 2014, but not in the same degree as I initially put, there is a great game in there somewhere, and with a complete overhaul of the level design and story structure, The Evil Within could be something great and not just merely interesting. The best way to describe this game is inconsistent, or a general phrase followed by, but not really. It's a stealth game, but not really. It's got limited combat, but not really. It's a survival horror game, but not really. But hey, maybe the DLC might shed some light on my lingering questions.